All right, so now that we've talked a lot about the scientific method and the different components to it, and we looked at some examples within science itself and just a regular scenario up above, let's take a look at now how we can apply that scientific method to fire investigations. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that even though we have sort of the general layout for the scientific method, the steps that we want to follow, the order they want to follow those steps, it very rarely happens in this nice prescribed manner. A lot of times, there are other steps that are thrown in, and depending on the situation that we're in, that we're studying, for example, there may be some additional steps involved. So keep that in mind as we go through the example. So, and this diagram is taken from a publication, NFPA 921, and it kind of relates the scientific method to just a generalized fire investigation. So the first thing that we want to do is you want to recognize the need or the needs and identify the problems that we're trying to solve in this particular investigation. So determining the problem statements, for example, or the questions that we need to address is the first step as we approach a fire investigation. Based on that, we want to define what the problem is. So having determined that we have a problem in the first place, there was a fire, for example, that spread, and we need to decide what the problem is. So, for example, we want to define the manner in which we can solve that problem. Right. So, for instance, we need to conduct a proper origin investigation. Where did the fire start? And a cause investigation as well. What caused the fire itself? And we can do that by examining the scene. We can combine other data collection methods. So, for example, reviewing any previous investigations that were conducted of that particular incident, any interviewing of witnesses, any results of scientific testing. And that's something that we're going to see within this particular example of the scientific method, is that data collection can happen at really any stage along the process, right? So recognizing or identifying the problem, defining what the problem is, and then the third step here, collecting the data. So we talked about data collection earlier on when we looked at the generalized scientific method, scientific process, information about the fire, or if it's explosion or whatever incident, we can now collect that by observation, qualitative, quantitative observations, by experiment, for example, or other direct data gathering means. That data that you collect then is called empirical data. Okay, and then what empirical means in this setting, it means that is capable of being verified, or it's capable, or it's known to be true, right? So that's the step that we're on right now. And again, this data collection that can occur at any stage, but nearly every stage in the process. Once the data is collected, we need to do something with the data, right? We're going to analyze the data itself. And that's really, really important, because analysis of the data is going to be based on the knowledge, the training, the expertise of the fire investigator themselves. In lots of cases, maybe that fire investigator doesn't have that expertise, in which case then that person needs to seek outside assistance to analyze the data. So, for example, let's say you collect a piece of wood, burnt, charred wood at the scene of the fire, and we need to analyze that data in a lab. Well, in most cases, the fire investigator is not going to have that expertise. You need to send it off to a specialized lab in order to examine, in order to analyze that piece of charred wood, to actually see, are there There are different chemicals in there, different things that are present that we couldn't necessarily see with your naked eyes. So analyzing the data is critical. And then understanding the meaning of the data then will enable the investigator to do the next step, which is to form a hypothesis or multiple hypotheses. So hypotheses is plural, based on the evidence, rather than speculating on what happened, right? So developing your hypothesis, and this is really important. Now we talked about hypotheses being sort of central to the scientific method. Is the same thing here. You're going to develop these hypotheses based on the data that was collected and based on analysis of the data to try to explain whatever phenomenon that was there, whether it was the nature of the fire pattern, how the fire spread, identifying the origin of the fire, identifying the ignition sequence, the cause of the fire, or the cause of damage, or the responsibility for the fire or the explosion or the incident. Right? Those are the hypotheses that we can develop based on the data that was collected and based on analysis of the data. That is known as inductive reasoning. Okay, so we're using the data to develop your hypotheses. Sometimes that's known as the bottom-up approach. Right? So you're starting with the data, and then based on that, you're developing your hypotheses. What comes after is then testing the hypotheses, or hypothesis, singular, or hypotheses, plural, and that is known as deductive reasoning, where we try to now relate a couple different things to each other. So for example, developing a hypothesis and then comparing the hypothesis to all of the known facts, as well as any body of scientific knowledge. That's one way in which we can test the hypothesis. These hypotheses, testing the hypotheses or the testing of the hypotheses need to be designed to try to disprove the hypothesis. Okay, this is the proper way to approach a fire investigation. When you test a hypothesis, you are trying to disprove it. And then you test your other hypothesis. So what you're doing is you're trying to rule out hypotheses from being correct, right? We can do that testing by experiment, as we've talked about previously. We can test the hypotheses analytically by applying physical principles, scientific principles. So not actually doing an experiment, but analyzing using our previous knowledge, or we can refer to scientific research of similar scenarios, right? So you look up and do some research, and when you refer to scientific research of similar scenarios, what you would want to do is you want to make sure that you have very, very, very similar, if not identical, situations or settings for the fire, so you can make some valid or draw some valid conclusions. Okay, so we have developed our hypotheses, inductive reasoning, using the data that was collected and analyzed. Then those hypotheses can be tested, comparing the hypotheses to all the known facts as well as the body of scientific knowledge. Testing of the hypotheses need to be such that we want to disprove them. We want to rule them out, in other words, as being possible causes of the fire, for instance. And we can test them by experimentation. We can test them analytically by applying principles, or we can test them by referring to the literature, to scientific research of similar scenarios. And then finally, what we're going to do after we've ruled out all of the possible hypotheses that couldn't lead to the cause of the fire, for example, then we're going to select the very final hypothesis. All right, so selecting that final hypothesis then is the last step in this process. And really what we're trying to figure out here is, were there any other hypotheses that were consistent with the data? And if there is, then we're actually not done. You need to go back and test those hypotheses again. So really what we're ending up with here is the only hypothesis that was not disproven, right? So out of all the hypotheses that you could have developed based on the data that you collected, you're disproving all of them except the one that couldn't be disproven, which would be your final hypothesis. All right, so again, we talked about the general process of the scientific method, and we can see little bits and snippets of that in a generalized fire investigation scenario, right? And what's central to this here is collecting your data, analyzing your data, and hypotheses, developing hypotheses, and then testing those hypotheses as well, right? That's really critical to investigating or to fire investigations. You will talk a lot more about this when you get deeper into your into more of your fire courses down the road.